It's a pleasure to welcome to studio dperry, International Affairs Analyst and the former Europe and Middle East editor at the Associated Press, and our correspondent, Valer Sladin. Gentlemen, thank you both so much. Days of Destiny, the words of J.D. Vance. Quite something, Dan, in all your years of covering these regions, to look at number two, the 2IC out of the United States here in Israel at this critical juncture in this region. Your sense of what we saw, the optics of these two men meeting on this day.
It's extremely good that the U.S. is projecting that it is so invested in the ceasefire, but not only the ceasefire, and seeing the full extent of the ceasefire and all 20 points implemented. And clearly, the president being here last week, the vice president, Marco Rubio on his way, the two major negotiators, Wickoff and Jared Kushner, this is a major show of force. And they said all the right things. However, I must say that there is a certain skepticism and to an extent concern in Israel that what they're trying to do is to keep Israel from resuming the war and to sort of, give Netanyahu a bear hug and prevent him from doing anything too wild. I always thought that was a little bit silly because Israel cannot resume the war without American permission effectively. But they want to maintain a narrative where everyone's on side, and they emphasize that today. We're such great partners, and no one's imposing anything on anyone. The problem is, to me, the music was one of process and of negotiation and take your time, and I think the reality is very different. The Middle East abhors a vacuum, and you see very clearly Hamas moving with a speed and determination to reestablish real control in part of the Gaza Strip, appointing chieftains everywhere and massacring their opponents. This is not the policy of a group that thinks it doesn't have a future. Hamas never agreed to the 20 points in public. Trump said, but Trump says many, many things. I never heard from Hamas that they agreed to any of it. And that's a very major gap. It's clear to me that Hamas thinks they can get away with U.S. backing for continued ceasefire under effectively the terms they offered Israel long ago, which was take back the hostages in exchange for an end to the war. I know that the circumstances are slightly different because Israel controls the perimeter still, but it looks like Hamas got what it wanted if this ends now. They're clearly going to try to fudge it. So what is needed is, I think, more than general statements that it'll take time and as much hard work. There's very simple work to be done. There needs to be a clear, resolute public statement that nothing will happen in Gaza that is good until Hamas disarms. They need the mediators in public making this clear, and they need to actually start making plans for what happens if Hamas says no. And that would involve building humanitarian cities in the part of Gaza Israel controls where there is no Hamas to move the population out, because if you're not letting reconstruction aid in, that's unfair to the population. They need an alternative, and it can be a refugee city on the Egyptian side of the Rafah border, maybe. They'd have to be bribed, but the world has money. It could be allowing Palestinians to go to the West Bank. You need a solution for the Palestinians if what I suspect might happen happens, and that is that Hamas continues to basically make a mockery of the deal. It's clear that's where it's going, and I'd like to see more resolute U.S. statements. You have a bit of that coming from Trump, but it's not attached to any actual plan. You need a plan.
And of course, if Hamas continues to violate the deal already, the chances increase, of course, that Israel could, in fact, realistically resume that war.
They need American permission, but they might get it.
They might very well get it. Let's bring in Professor Kobi Michael, Senior Research Fellow at INSS and the Mizgav Institute, and the former Deputy Director General in the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs, joining us from Netziona. Professor, thank you so much. J.D. Vance, the U.S. Vice President, is upbeat. He's working to make sure the ceasefire holds. American officials are speaking to a range of countries to be part of this peacekeeping force in Gaza, including Indonesia, UAE, Egypt, Qatar, Turkey, and Azerbaijan. Israel has already said a flat no to Turkey for very obvious reasons. What is your sense of this peacekeeping plan? How can Israelis feel safe with this array of nations involved?
They cannot. I did a very long academic mileage on the idea of peacekeeping force operations and stabilization operations, and the the experience that we have for decades is not such an encouraging experience when it comes to peacekeeping operations in the entire globe, okay? There are very few successes, very, very few.
Dperry, a minute to the break, your thoughts?
When you see countries like Qatar and Turkey being involved, there are two ways to look at it. One, they're going to still continue to support Hamas and enable the fudge that we all suspect. The other is something else. These countries are on the edge. A country like Qatar for long has played both sides. And perhaps roping them into this process, having them be involved as possible, having Turkey be involved, when Turkey clearly wants a defense relationship with the U.S., and perhaps wants to reestablish itself as a member of NATO in good standing and not just informal standing, maybe that'll bring them on side and reestablish a larger, more effective alliance against the true implacable enemies, the likes of Iran and the various jihadists in the world.
Well, many questions remain, and obviously the intentions of all these nations, dubious indeed.
They'll be tested at this point.
Certainly they will be tested, but at what cost remains the deeper. Dan, when one looks at the Abraham Accords, stakeholders like the UAE saying annexation would be against the spirit of the normalization deals. There's lots at stake here when you see developments like this. Your concerns, your thoughts?
It is ridiculous for 500,000 Israelis to be living in towns that aren't part of Israel. That, in a way, is historically unprecedented. So, in a sense, the partial annexations of areas where Jews live and have lived for decades, and which are very close to the border and are generally understood to likely be part of Israel in any future, God willing, partition deal, it doesn't not make sense. There's a certain logic to it in a way, but in the grander scheme of things, it's incredible folly. Just about the last thing in the world that Israel needs, given the delegitimization that it has suffered because of the brutality of the Gaza war and all the propaganda directed at Israel, the last thing it needs right now is more friction with the entire planet over annexing part of a territory that half the world recognizes as a Palestinian state, unwisely, prematurely. I'm against it. But it just introduces another fight with the entire world, which is why it's hilarious to see all the tough guys in the right-wing government right now are against it. Never mind the particular context that you have the vice president here, the two major negotiators, and Rubio arriving tomorrow. Of course, it's nothing but a provocation. It's nothing but dangerous. And it embarrasses Israel's Arab friends. The general expectation of Israel is to keep the status quo going until such time that there's a deal. And when there's a deal with the Palestinian state, hopefully demilitarized, whatever it'll be, Israel will then be able to annex the territories where most of the settlers live. Territories deep inside the West Bank may have to be addressed a different way. Maybe the settlers are removed. Maybe they become citizens of Palestine. But any talk of annexation right now is a provocation that, on the one hand, if it's carried out, would bring diplomatic difficulties, if not disaster. On the other hand, obviously is meant to embarrass the government, just as Balir was saying. I would note 25 people voting in favor. This is a preliminary vote. It doesn't mean, at the end of the day, after 3 or 4 more votes happen, on that day, you'll have full attendance at the Knesset. And I can't imagine a responsible government that would actually approve of it.
Briefly, your response.
Yes, definitely. So regardless of anyone's opinion on the annexation of the West Bank as a whole or all the settlements, we see that Israel did manage actually to annex many territories over the past few decades that were actually only in the past decade or less than a decade and 5-6 years ago have been recognized by the United States. I'm talking here, of course, about the Golan Heights and the all of Jerusalem, the west of Jerusalem. So that's something that needs lots of time, needs preparation, infrastructure, and definitely diplomatic efforts and the right timing. This is not the right timing, absolutely not. So apparently the Likud in their statement today were right about this because it's not the right time. Again, this is regardless of your opinion on the act itself.
I would just add real quick, the Golan Heights is not the same demographic complication that the West Bank and Gaza would be. It's not seen as part of this globally resonant Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The war in Syria that caused Syria to fall apart made it easier for the world to accept that the Golan is just Israel's. A more interesting case is East Jerusalem. But East Jerusalem was annexed many decades ago under an entirely different set of facts.
Certainly interesting and historical times ahead. Dan Perry, thank you as always. Correspondent Balech Sladin, thank you for being here in studio.